They were standing in complete darkness, not allowed to move, not allowed to speak, not allowed to ask a single question. And some of them had been standing there for hours. No one told them when it would end. No one told them why it had begun. The only thing they knew was that the man who brought them here had a reputation that made even the most educated people in the ancient world go quiet when his name came up. And that man was not a king, not a warlord, not a high priest. He was a philosopher named Ariston of Thrace, and everything history remembers about him fits on half a page of a school textbook, which is exactly the way he would have wanted it. Here is what the textbooks never told you. Ariston did not spend his life developing theories for scholars to argue over in comfortable rooms. He spent it building something that the powerful people of his time found genuinely threatening: a school. Not the kind with benches and lectures and exams, a school where the first lesson lasted years and consisted entirely of silence. Where the price of entry was not money or status, but the willingness to dissolve everything you thought you were. Where the knowledge being transmitted was considered so dangerous that it was never written down, not because they were lazy, but because they understood that certain things, once written, become weapons. And Ariston had seen what happened when dangerous knowledge reached unprepared hands. But to understand why he built that school, why he demanded that silence, why he surrounded his teachings in ritual and shadow, you have to go back further. Back to a younger version of Ariston, before the school, before the reputation, before the disciples who stood in the dark waiting for instructions. You have to go back to the moment everything changed for him. And that moment did not happen in Greece. It happened underground, beneath the stone floors of a temple on the western bank of the Nile, in a chamber so old that the torches along its walls had blackened the ceiling into a surface that looked like open sky. He was barely past his 20s. He had traveled for months to reach that place, driven by something he could not name, a pull that felt less like curiosity and more like a memory he had not yet recovered. The priests had accepted him after weeks of observation. They had said almost nothing to him during that period. They watched how he ate, how he walked, how he reacted when someone contradicted him, how long he could sit still without inventing reasons to move. Only after all of that did they bring him down into the chamber. And then they left him alone there in the dark. What happened next is not something that translates easily into ordinary language. But Ariston spent the rest of his life trying to describe it. He said the silence in that chamber was not empty. It had texture, weight. He said it pressed against his skin the way deep water does. He sat there for what felt like an entire night, maybe longer, and at some point, the boundary between the sound of his own breathing and the sound of the room around him began to dissolve. And then, something else happened. Underneath all of it, underneath the silence itself, he became aware of something moving. Not sound exactly, more like the feeling of sound, a vibration so low and so vast that it had no source, no direction, no beginning. It was simply there, the way gravity is there, the way time is there, except that this felt older than both. He did not hear the universe that night. He felt its pulse. And once you have felt something like that, once it has moved through you and left its mark, you cannot go back to believing the world is made of solid, separate, indifferent objects. You know too much. And Ariston knew, sitting on that cold stone floor in the dark, that the rest of his life would be spent figuring out what he had just touched. That feeling, that pulse beneath everything, became the foundation of every single thing he would later teach. Not as a metaphor, not as poetry, as literal, investigable, provable truth. Because Ariston was not a mystic who wanted people to simply believe him. He was a man who had felt something real and wanted to find the structure behind it. And what he eventually found was both simpler and stranger than anyone expected. The universe, he concluded, was not built from matter. It was built from relationship, from tension, from vibration, from the invisible pull between opposites that generates everything we can see, hear, and touch. He called it harmony, not in the way we use the word today, as a soft and pleasant thing. He meant it the way an architect means a load-bearing wall, the thing that holds everything else up. And here is what made Ariston different from every other thinker of his time. He did not keep this to himself. He did not retreat into solitary contemplation and write elegant scrolls for posterity. He went home. He built something. He started teaching. And what he taught would eventually become so threatening to the people around him that they would burn his school to the ground. But that comes later. Because before the fire, there was the discovery. And before the discovery, there was that one night in a chamber beneath the Nile when a young man sat in absolute darkness and felt the world breathe. If this kind of knowledge resonates with you, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find their way to these ideas. The morning after Ariston emerged from that underground chamber, one of the elder priests handed him a single linen string, knotted at both ends, stretched between two small wooden pegs. No explanation, no instruction, just the string, and a look that said, "Figure it out." Ariston spent 3 days with that string. He plucked it, he tightened it, he loosened it, he divided it in half with his finger and plucked again. And somewhere in the middle of the second day, something clicked into place so cleanly that he later described it as the most quietly violent moment of his life. When he divided the string exactly in half, the note that rang out was not just similar to the original. It was the same note, elevated, purified, like the original had been washed and returned to him. He divided it again. Same thing. The proportion produced harmony. Every single time. Without exception. That would have been interesting enough on its own. A musical curiosity. A pleasant discovery about string tension and pitch. Except that Ariston could not stop there, because his mind was not built for stopping. He started measuring other things. The distance between pillars in the temple courtyard, the spacing of certain star clusters that the priests had been tracking for generations, the rate at which water drops fell from the temple's stone cistern into the basin below. And he kept finding the same ratios, not approximations, not near matches, the exact same proportions that made a string sing. He would crouch over those measurements in the temple dust with a stick, drawing ratios, checking them, erasing them, redrawing them, and the priests would walk past without comment, as if they had seen this particular moment of realization happen before, as if it were simply one of the things that happened when you left someone alone with a string and enough silence. What Ariston understood in those days was not just that music follows mathematical rules. That alone would have been a footnote in history. What he understood was that the mathematics did not belong to music. Music had simply revealed it. The proportions were already there, woven into the structure of the physical world, into distance and weight and time and motion, and music was just the place where human senses were sensitive enough to detect them. The harmony was not something composers created. It was something they stumbled onto when they accidentally aligned with a pattern that already existed. And that pattern existed everywhere, which meant that the world was not random, not chaotic, not indifferent. It had been assembled according to a logic that was simultaneously mathematical and, there is no other honest word for it, beautiful. Not decoratively beautiful. Beautiful the way a perfect argument is beautiful. Beautiful the way a solution is beautiful when it turns out to be inevitable. Ariston sat with this for a long time, because the implications were enormous and also deeply uncomfortable. If the world has a structure, if reality is built on proportion and relation and vibration, then the question becomes, what does it mean to live out of alignment with that structure? What happens to a person who is, in the most literal sense, out of tune? He had felt the answer to that in his own body, in the years before that underground chamber. Years of restlessness and confusion and the persistent sense that he was moving through the world slightly sideways, like a door hanging off its frame. And he had felt the opposite in that chamber, when the vibration moved through him and everything, briefly, resolved. He knew what alignment felt like from the inside, and he knew that most people he had ever met were living their entire lives without once experiencing it. Not because it was unavailable, because no one had ever shown them where to look. That was the moment Ariston stopped being a student and started becoming something else entirely. Not a teacher yet. Not quite. More like a man who has found a door in a wall that everyone else walks past every day without noticing, and who cannot, in good conscience, walk away without telling someone it is there. He did not know yet what that would cost him. He did not know about the school he would build, the disciples who would stand in the dark waiting for him, the fire that would eventually come. All he knew, standing in that temple courtyard with proportion ratios drawn in the dust at his feet, was that the universe had a grammar, and he had just learned the first letter of its alphabet. Most people who hear the word number picture something cold, a label, a tool for counting coins or measuring distance. But Ariston had just spent weeks staring at ratios drawn in temple dust, watching the same proportions appear in string vibrations and star positions and falling water. And he had arrived at a conclusion that would have gotten him laughed out of any respectable academic circle of his time. Numbers were not invented. They were discovered. And the difference between those two things is not semantic. It is everything. Think about what it means if numbers are invented. It means they are human constructs, useful fictions we agree on to make trade and measurement easier. Convenient tools we could, in principle, replace with something else. But if numbers are discovered, if they exist independently of human minds the way mountains exist independently of the people who name them, then something much stranger is true. It means reality has a preference. It means the universe is not neutral. It means that before the first stone was laid, before the first breath was drawn, before anything existed that could be counted, the relationships between things were already fixed, already waiting, already true. And Ariston believed this not as a spiritual comfort, but as a conclusion forced on him by what he had measured with his own hands. He started with the simplest case. 1. Not the numeral, the principle. The state of being undivided, whole, prior to any distinction. Ariston described it as the condition before the question is asked, before separation, before direction, before anything can be compared to anything else, there is one. And from one, the moment any kind of awareness or movement occurs, you immediately have two. Not 1 plus 1, just the recognition that there is a here and a there, a self and another, an inside and an outside. 2 is not addition. 2 is the birth of tension. And tension, as Ariston had felt in that string stretched between two pegs, is the condition for everything that makes sound, everything that creates form, everything that generates energy. The entire physical world, in this view, is the product of an unresolved tension between opposites that can never fully collapse into each other and never fully separate. That tension is why anything exists at all. 3, then, is not what comes after 2. 3 is what happens when tension finds a point of resolution, a third element that holds the opposing forces in relation without canceling either of them. Think of it as the note that makes two discordant strings suddenly make sense together. Think of it as the moment an argument finds its answer, not by one side winning, but by a third perspective appearing that neither side had considered. 3 is the structure of resolution. And 4, Ariston taught, is where resolution becomes solid, becomes weight, becomes something you can stand on. 4 is the point at which abstract relationship becomes physical reality. 1 point, 2 points making a line, 3 points making a surface, 4 points making a shape with depth. Everything that exists in physical space, everything you can touch and walk around and measure from multiple sides, is a 4. And Ariston would draw this progression in the air with his finger, watching the faces of whoever he was explaining it to, waiting for the moment when the abstraction landed and became real. When the person stopped hearing a sequence of ideas and started feeling the shape of reality clicking into place around them. Because here is what made this more than philosophy. It was also a diagnostic tool. If you understood the nature of these principles, you could look at any situation in the world, any relationship, any system, any moment of conflict or harmony, and identify exactly where in that sequence things had gone wrong. Was something unresolved at the level of 2? A tension being denied rather than acknowledged? Was something stuck at 3? A resolution being offered that neither party truly accepted? Was something collapsing at 4? A structure that looked solid but was built on proportions that were slightly off? Numbers, for Ariston, were not descriptions of quantities. They were descriptions of states. And knowing the states meant you could navigate the world with a precision that looked, to anyone watching from the outside, almost like prophecy. He carried this understanding back to Thrace, like a man carrying an ember cupped in both hands, careful not to let the wind take it, certain that if he could keep it alive long enough to reach the right people, it would eventually become a fire. But he had no way of knowing yet how literally that image would one day play out. The string had taught Ariston the proportions. The temple had shown him they were universal. But it was a moment back in a small workshop near the port of his hometown that turned understanding into obsession, and obsession into mission. A craftsman there built instruments, simple ones, lyres and pipes, mostly for local festivals and market gatherings. Ariston had been watching him work for several days, sitting in the corner of the workshop with the smell of fresh-cut cedar in the air and sawdust settling on his clothes, saying nothing. The craftsman, a heavy-set man named Doros, who found silence in other people slightly threatening, eventually asked what exactly Ariston was looking for. Ariston said he was watching the proportions. Doros put down his tool and stared at him. Then, without a word, he picked up 2 finished lyres, tuned them both to what he called a natural resting pitch, the way he always did, by ear and habit, and handed one to Ariston. He plucked a single string. Ariston plucked the corresponding string on his own instrument. The 2 notes rose and met in the air above them, and locked together in a way that was almost physical, a chord so clean it felt less like sound, and more like a door clicking shut on a perfectly fitted frame. Doros nodded slowly, as if that had been his answer to a question Ariston had not quite finished asking yet. What followed was several hours that Ariston later described as the most clarifying of his adult life. They tested every combination, every interval, and every time the ratio between 2 string lengths was clean, whole, expressible as a simple relationship between small numbers, the result was harmony. Every time the ratio was fractured, approximate, slightly off, the result was friction. Not always unpleasant friction, sometimes beautiful tension. But the difference between resolution and irresolution was always, without exception, a question of proportion. Not taste, not culture, not the preference of the listener. The mathematics did not care about any of that. It simply produced a result according to its own internal logic. And the human ear, without any training whatsoever, without any theory or education, responded to that logic correctly every single time. This was the thing that made Ariston go very still in that workshop, still enough that Doros stopped what he was doing and looked at him carefully. Because what this meant was that the human body already knows. Before any teacher explains it, before any book describes it, before any school transmits it, something inside a person already recognizes proportion, already knows what alignment feels like, already responds to the correct ratio as though greeting something familiar. Which could only mean one thing. The pattern is not outside us. It is also in us. We are not observers of the structure. We are made of it. And if that is true, if the same proportions that govern vibrating strings and the spacing of stars are also woven into the tissue of a human being, then the question of how to live well is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a tuning problem. And Ariston had just realized he might know how to solve it. Ariston once made a grown man weep using nothing but a sequence of 4 notes played on a lyre, and he did it deliberately, as an experiment, to prove a point to a room full of people who thought he was losing his mind. The man had not been sad. He had walked into the room in a perfectly stable mood. But Ariston had identified, through weeks of careful observation, exactly which interval combination bypassed the thinking mind entirely and went straight to something deeper, something underneath the layer where a person decides how they feel. He played the sequence. The man sat quietly for a moment. Then his face changed. Then the tears came. And Ariston turned to the room and said, "That is not music. That is a key. And the lock it opens is inside every single one of you." This was not a performance trick. It was the practical outcome of everything he had learned since that afternoon in Doros, the craftsman's workshop, when he had understood that the human body already knows proportion, already responds to correct ratio the way a dry field responds to rain, not because someone taught it to, but because it is built from the same material as the pattern itself. Once Ariston understood that, the next question was obvious. If the body recognizes alignment instinctively, what happens when you apply that knowledge with intention? What happens when you stop letting sound wash over you randomly and start using it the way a surgeon uses a precise tool? He spent a long period testing this, quietly, carefully, on himself first. He began ending each day by playing a specific sequence of intervals, low and slow, almost like breathing made audible, and he noticed that the quality of his sleep changed within a week. Not longer sleep, cleaner sleep. The kind where you wake up and the night feels like it actually did something, like something was processed and returned to order. Then he started the mornings with a different sequence, higher, moving upward in steps that matched the ratio he kept finding everywhere, in strings, in stone, in water. And his mornings changed too. The mental fog that most people accept as a normal feature of waking up simply stopped being there. He was present from the first moment, oriented, clear. He brought this to a small group of people he had begun meeting with regularly, a mix of thinkers and craftsmen, and a few younger students who had heard about his ideas through Doros and wanted to understand more. He gave them the same sequences, asked them to use them consistently for 30 days, and report back honestly. What came back was not uniform, because people are not uniform, but the patterns were unmistakable. Better sleep, reduced anxiety, a quality of attention during the day that several of them described, independently of each other using the same word. Sharper, not louder or faster, sharper, like a lens coming into focus. And one woman in the group, a weaver named Thessa, who had been dealing with persistent low-level dread for as long as she could remember, reported that after 3 weeks, the dread had simply quieted. Not vanished, quieted. Like a fire that had been burning constantly and had finally, for the first time, been given less fuel than it needed to maintain itself. Ariston was careful about how he interpreted this. He did not claim the sound was healing anyone. He claimed it was removing interference. There is a difference. A healer fixes something broken. What Ariston believed he was doing was closer to what happens when you remove a stone from a stream, and the water, which was already trying to flow correctly, immediately finds its natural course again. The body already knows how to function. The mind already knows how to think. The soul, whatever that word means, already knows its direction. Sound, used correctly, did not add anything. It cleared the channel. And a cleared channel, in Ariston's understanding, was not a luxury or a comfort. It was a prerequisite. You cannot think clearly through constant noise. You cannot feel the deeper pulse of things through a surface churned by agitation. Silence and correct sound were not pleasant additions to a well-lived life. They were the foundation that made a well-lived life structurally possible. But here is the part of this that Ariston never said publicly. The part he shared only with the people he trusted most, the part that made even some of his closest associates deeply uncomfortable. He believed that a person who remained chronically misaligned, not just occasionally but as a permanent condition, was not simply unhappy or unwell. He believed they were generating a kind of interior static that prevented them from perceiving anything that mattered. And a person who cannot perceive what matters cannot make real choices, cannot grow, cannot move, just repeats. Over and over, the same patterns, the same reactions, the same life in different clothes. And that idea, that the misaligned soul is not suffering but stuck, not in pain, but in a loop. That idea would become the hinge on which everything else in his teaching turned. Because if that was true, then the question of how to live was not primarily about morality or achievement or comfort. It was about getting free. And Ariston had started to develop very specific ideas about what that freedom required and how far back the problem actually went. Further back, it turned out, than most people were prepared to consider. Much further back than a single life. There is a question that most people avoid because the honest answer is too large to sit with comfortably. What survives you? Not your reputation, not the things you built or the people you affected. Those are echoes. What actually survives you, the essential moving thing that you are when everything external is stripped away. Most people, when they actually stop and sit with this question rather than batting it away, feel something that is not quite fear and not quite recognition, but lives somewhere between the two. Like approaching a room in a house you have never been in, but somehow already know the layout of. Ariston felt this. He had felt it first in that underground chamber in the temple, when the vibration moved through him, and he had the distinct and unshakable sensation that whatever he was, it was older than his body, older than his name, older than Thrace, older than the language he thought in, older than any category he had ever been given to describe himself. He did not construct a theory around this experience. He investigated it. He spent years in conversation with the Egyptian priests who had trained him, pressing them on what their oldest traditions actually said about the nature of a person after the body stops. He sought out wandering teachers from the Eastern Islands who carried fragments of much older teachings about the soul and what it carries between lives. He compared what they said with what he had observed in people, the inexplicable fears that had no origin in the current life, the instant deep recognition between strangers who had never met, the children who spoke with a gravity and a knowing that made no sense given how recently they had arrived. He assembled what he found not into a doctrine, but into a map, provisional, honest, willing to be revised, but pointing consistently in one direction. The soul, in Ariston's understanding, does not begin at birth and end at death. It moves through time the way a traveler moves through countries, spending time in each, being shaped by each, carrying forward what was learned and leaving behind what was only borrowed. The body is not who you are, it is where you are. And the difference between those two things is not a comforting spiritual idea, it is a practical one. Because if you are not the body, then the things the body accumulates, its fears, its habits, its addictions to comfort and avoidance, are not your identity. They are your current luggage, heavy perhaps, maybe packed badly, but not permanent, not you. And that distinction, simple as it sounds, was the thing Ariston believed most people needed to hear more than anything else he had ever discovered. Because a person who believes they are their habits has no reason to change, but a person who understands their habits are just what they are currently carrying has every reason to put the bag down. And the moment someone actually does that, even for a second, the whole shape of what is possible for them shifts completely. But the soul does not carry only luggage, Ariston warned. It also carries something else. Something that complicates the picture considerably. And understanding what that something is would require his students to look at their own lives, their own patterns, their own seemingly random circumstances in a way that was deeply confronting. Because nothing, he was about to tell them, was random. Not even the parts they most wished were. Ariston told one of his closest students something that the student did not speak about publicly for years afterward, because he was not sure the world was ready to hear it. He said that the body is not your home, it is your assignment. And the moment that landed, really landed, not as a clever phrase but as a felt truth, the student said it was like the floor dropped out from under him, and he discovered he had never needed it. This was the teaching that separated the people who found Ariston interesting from the people who were genuinely changed by him. The idea that the soul is not a product of the body, not something the body generates the way a fire generates heat, but something the body temporarily houses, the way a harbor temporarily holds a ship. The ship existed before the harbor. It will exist after. The harbor is useful. It provides shelter, structure, a place to take on provisions and make repairs. But the harbor is not the destination. And mistaking it for the destination is the error that costs everything. Ariston had absorbed this from multiple directions. The Egyptian priests who trained him spoke about the human being as a layered structure, a set of different elements that only appear unified during life and separate at death, each following its own path. He had found similar ideas in the teachings of wandering mystics he encountered during his years of travel. People who came from traditions so old they had no name for themselves, who described the soul as a current moving through different vessels across long stretches of time. What struck Ariston was not that these traditions agreed on every detail. They did not. What struck him was that they all agreed on the central point. The essential thing in a person is not generated by that person's body. It arrives, it inhabits, it departs. And what determines where it departs to is the quality of what happened while it was here. He used an image that his students found both clarifying and deeply unsettling. Imagine, he said, a craftsman who works with clay. The clay takes the shape of whatever the craftsman impresses into it. Leave it long enough, fire it correctly, and the impression becomes permanent. The soul, moving through a life, is being impressed upon constantly. Every choice, every repeated thought, every habitual reaction is pressing a shape into something that will outlast the current vessel. You are not just living a life, you are shaping the thing that will carry your essential self into whatever comes next. And most people, he said quietly, are pressing in shapes they would never consciously choose if they understood what they were doing. This was not meant as a warning designed to create anxiety. Ariston was careful about that distinction. He had seen what happened when people encountered this idea through the lens of fear. They became rigid, obsessive, desperate to control every small act in case it had cosmic consequences. That was not the point. The point was attention. The point was the difference between a life lived automatically, where the impressions are being made by habit and reaction, and the noise of other people's expectations, and a life lived with some degree of wakefulness, where you are at least present enough to notice what you are pressing into yourself. The first kind of life shapes the soul without your participation. The second gives you a say, and having a say, Ariston believed, was the entire point of being here. He also taught something about the body that most of his contemporaries found radical enough to be offensive. He said it deserved respect. Deep, serious, practical respect. Not because it was the most important thing about you, but precisely because it was the instrument through which the soul did its work in this particular passage. A craftsman who neglects his tools does not produce good work, regardless of his skill or intention. The body needed correct food, correct rest, correct movement, correct sound, all the things Ariston had been exploring and testing. Not for comfort, for function. The soul needed a clear instrument to work through, and an instrument that was constantly overwhelmed, poisoned, deprived, or numbed was an instrument that distorted everything passing through it, the way a warped lens distorts the image it was meant to clarify. His students began to understand, slowly, that every practical instruction Ariston gave them, about sleep and food and sound and silence, was not a lifestyle preference. It was maintenance. It was keeping the instrument in a condition where the deeper work was even possible. And the deeper work, he was now ready to explain, was not something you could do alone. Not really. Not at the level he was pointing toward. It required a specific kind of environment, a specific kind of community, a specific kind of container. And he had spent years thinking about how to build one. The school Ariston eventually built in the coastal city of Velia did not look, from the outside, like anything particularly remarkable. A series of connected stone buildings set back from the main road, a courtyard with a single olive tree in the center, a small hall for gatherings, several rooms for quiet study. No grand entrance, no visible symbols of power, no indication that what happened inside those walls was, by any reasonable measure, the most rigorous and demanding inner training program that had ever been assembled in that part of the world. The selection process alone would have ended most people's interest immediately. Candidates were not interviewed, they were observed, for weeks, sometimes longer. Ariston, or one of his senior students, would encounter a potential candidate in ordinary circumstances, through a mutual contact or at a public gathering, and would simply pay attention. Not to what the person said, to what they did when they thought no one was watching. How they treated people who had nothing to offer them. How they responded when something went wrong unexpectedly. Whether they could tolerate uncertainty without immediately trying to fill it with noise. Most people failed the stage without ever knowing they were being evaluated. Those who passed were not congratulated. They were given a single instruction. Come to the building on the eastern side of the Olive Courtyard on a specific morning and bring nothing except yourself. No books, no writing materials, no prepared questions. Just show up and be present. And when they arrived and sat down in that plain room with the others who had also passed the initial observation, Ariston would look at them for a long moment and then say something that nobody was ever quite prepared for. He would say, "The first thing you are going to learn here is how to stop talking. And you are going to practice that until you are genuinely good at it. That might take you 3 months. It might take you 2 years. But nothing else begins until that is real." The silence he required was not the silence of someone holding their breath. It was not performed stillness or suppressed speech. It was an active, attentive, inhabited silence. The kind that requires more energy than most conversations. The kind that starts to reveal, after sustained practice, how much of what a person normally calls thinking is actually just noise repeating itself with minor variations. Ariston had discovered this in that underground chamber years before, and he had spent the time since then understanding exactly how to transmit the experience to others. Because he knew that everything else he wanted to teach, the nature of numbers, the structure of harmony, the deep mechanics of the soul, could only be received correctly by someone who had learned to clear the channel first. Pour clean water into a dirty vessel, and it becomes dirty water. The vessel had to be cleaned, and silence was how you cleaned it. What happened inside a person during those months of enforced quiet was different for everyone and similar in the ways that mattered. The internal noise, which at first felt unbearable, gradually began to reveal its own structure. Students started noticing that their thoughts were not as original as they had assumed, that most of what passed through their minds was borrowed, inherited, reactive, repetitive. That underneath all of that borrowed noise, there was something else, quieter, more consistent, something that did not change depending on the mood of the day or the opinion of the last person they had spoken to. Ariston called this the signal beneath the static, and he said that learning to hear it was not the end of the training. It was the beginning. Because once you could actually hear it, what it had to tell you was going to change everything you thought you knew about yourself. One of Ariston's senior students, a man named Evander, who had been with the school for several years, asked him once whether the soul chose its circumstances before arriving in a new life, or simply inherited whatever was waiting. Ariston was quiet for a long time before answering. Then he said something that Evander repeated to other students in a lowered voice, the way you repeat something that feels too significant to say at full volume. He said, "It does not matter whether the soul chooses or inherits. What matters is that it arrives with unfinished work. And until that work is finished, the circumstances will keep finding it. In different forms, in different lives, but always recognizably the same underlying lesson, wearing a different costume each time." This was the part of Ariston's teaching that required the most from his students. Not the mathematics, not the silence practice, not the regulated sleep and food. Those were demanding but manageable. This was different. This asked a person to look at their own suffering, their own recurring patterns, their own seemingly inexplicable fears and compulsions, and consider the possibility that none of it was accidental. That the thing they kept running into, the type of person who kept appearing in their life to cause the same particular kind of pain, the specific situation that kept collapsing in the same specific way, no matter how carefully they tried to build it differently, was not bad luck, was not coincidence, was curriculum. Ariston used the image of a river cutting through stone. The water does not choose to carve the same channel every time. It simply follows the path of least resistance, which is the channel it carved before. The soul, moving through successive lives, tends to follow its own grooves, its established patterns, its unresolved tendencies, its habitual ways of responding to pressure. And those grooves deepen with each pass until the soul either develops enough awareness to recognize the pattern and deliberately choose a different path, or continues cutting deeper into the same channel until the groove becomes a canyon. The difference between a person who is growing across lifetimes and one who is simply repeating is not intelligence or talent or even effort. It is the willingness to see the groove for what it is, instead of just living inside it. For the students in Velia, who had spent months in silence and were now beginning to hear what Ariston called the signal beneath the static, this teaching landed with a specific kind of weight. Because in that silence, many of them had already started noticing their own grooves, the thoughts that circled back without invitation, the reactions that fired before any conscious decision was made, the particular flavors of fear and desire that seemed to have no clear origin in anything that had happened to them in this life. Ariston was giving them a framework for what they had already begun to feel, and the framework was uncomfortable in the precise way that true things tend to be uncomfortable, not because it was cruel, but because it removed a particular kind of excuse, the excuse of randomness, the excuse of just being this way. Because if nothing was random, and every pattern had a source, and every source could be traced and understood, then every pattern could also, in principle, be changed. And that meant the responsibility for who you were sat entirely in your own hands. This was not a popular idea outside the walls of the school in Velia. Most people found it much easier to believe that circumstances were external, that life happened to them rather than through them, that the shapes of their struggles were the result of forces beyond their control. Ariston did not argue with this publicly. He simply built a place where people who were already tired of that explanation could come and learn something different. And he extended this same framework, this same refusal of the accidental, even to the question of which life form the soul inhabited in a given passage. He taught that the soul could move through different kinds of embodied existence across its long journey, and that each form offered something specific, a particular angle on experience, a particular set of constraints and capacities that forced the soul to develop something it had been avoiding. He did not present this as punishment or reward. He presented it as curriculum design. The soul gets what it needs to learn next, not what it might prefer. And this, he said, was why his students did not consume the flesh of other living creatures. Not from a rule, not from a tradition, from the recognition that every creature carrying life was also carrying something of what they themselves were. The soul in the animal did not have less dignity because it wore a different form. It had different work. And treating it as merely useful, merely edible, merely available, was to misunderstand the nature of the entire process they were all part of. Some students accepted this immediately and with relief, as if they had known it without having the words for it. Others struggled with it for a long time. But Ariston never pushed. He simply waited, the way he waited for everything. Because he had learned, in that underground chamber years before, that the right understanding, like the right note, arrives when the conditions are correct. You cannot force it. You can only prepare the ground. What Ariston had built in Velia by this point was something that had no real precedent. A living community organized entirely around the interior development of its members, where the outer structure, the meals, the schedule, the practices, the studies, existed solely to support work that was happening on a level no one could see from the outside. From the outside, it looked modest, orderly, slightly unusual in its quietness, the kind of place you could walk past without a second glance, which was, of course, exactly how Ariston wanted it. The community had grown gradually, not through recruitment, through reputation, the specific kind of reputation that travels quietly, person to person, through the kind of conversations that happen late in the evening when the performance of the day is finished and people are finally honest about what they are actually looking for. A merchant in Velia mentioned the school to a younger relative who had been unsettled since childhood by a sense that ordinary life was somehow beside the point. A physician who had briefly studied there before family obligations called him home told a colleague about the quality of attention that the training produced. Word moved slowly and selectively, which meant the people who eventually arrived were, in general, the ones for whom the timing was exactly right. The physical space of the school reflected Ariston's understanding of proportion in everything. The rooms were sized according to the same ratios he had first noticed in vibrating strings. The courtyard was laid out with dimensions that produced a specific quality of natural silence, the way certain valleys hold stillness differently from open ground. The single olive tree at the center had been chosen and planted with care, because Ariston believed that living things of sufficient age accumulated a kind of presence, a steadiness that affected the quality of attention in the space around them. Students ate together at a common table, not for social reasons, but because shared meals done in the right spirit were a form of calibration, a way of bringing a group of separate individuals into temporary alignment before the day's work began. Everything in the structure was intentional. Everything served the same central function, which was to create conditions where transformation was not just possible, but for a person of sufficient readiness, almost inevitable. Because Ariston had learned something from his years of teaching that he had not expected when he began. Transformation did not require extraordinary effort. It required extraordinary environment. Put a person in the right conditions, surround them with the right quality of silence and attention and honest practice, remove the noise and the distraction and the constant permission to avoid what matters, and the soul moves on its own. It knows the direction. It has always known. What it needs is not instruction so much as space, space to hear itself, space to remember what it came here to do. But creating that space, protecting it, keeping it intact against the inevitable pressure of a world that found the whole enterprise deeply suspicious, that turned out to be harder than anything Ariston had anticipated. Because the school was growing, and the people it was producing were beginning to move back into the world outside its walls, and the world outside was starting to notice them. Starting to notice that something about them was different, starting to ask where that difference came from. And not everyone who asked that question was asking it out of curiosity. There was a symbol carved into the stone above the entrance of the inner hall in Velia that most visitors walked under without giving it a second glance. It looked, at first sight, like a simple geometric shape, a triangle made of dots, arranged in rows of 1, 2, 3, and 4, each row sitting below the previous one, the whole thing pointing upward like an arrow aimed at something above the ceiling. Students who had been in the school for less than a year were not told what it meant. They saw it every day. They passed under it every morning on the way to the study hall. And Ariston never explained it, never pointed to it, never made it a subject of formal instruction. He waited until a student came to him and asked, because the moment of asking, he believed, was itself a sign. It meant the student had been quiet enough, long enough, to start noticing what was actually around them. When a student finally asked, Ariston would sit down with them and spend an entire afternoon on that single image. Not lecturing, asking questions and following the answers. He would start by asking the student to count the dots. 10. Then he would ask what 10 meant to them. Usually they would say something about completeness, about a full count, about the end of a sequence. And Ariston would nod slowly and then say, now look at how you get there. 1 dot alone, then 2 beneath it, then 3, then 4. And notice that each row is not just a number, it is a dimension. 1 is a point. It exists, but has no extension. 2 points make a line. A line has length, but no width. 3 points that are not all on the same line define a surface. A surface has area, but no depth. And 4 points that are not all on the same surface define a volume. A shape with depth, something you can hold, something that exists in physical space the way you and I exist in physical space. The student at this point would usually go very still, because what Ariston had just described was not an abstract geometric exercise. He had described the complete sequence from nothing to something, from a single point of pure potential to a fully realized three-dimensional form. And he had shown that the journey from one to the other required exactly 4 steps and no more. Which meant that the number 4 was not just a quantity. It was the precise minimum required for physical reality to exist at all. And the 10 that the whole triangle added up to was not just a round number. It was the record of that entire journey, compressed into a single image, carved in stone above a doorway, so that every person who passed under it was, whether they knew it or not, walking through a reminder that reality has a structure, and that structure is knowable. Students who reached this understanding often describe something shifting in how they experienced everyday space afterward. The proportions of rooms, the spacing between columns in public buildings, the way the olive tree in the courtyard cast its shadow at different hours. Everything began to feel less arbitrary, more intentional, as if the visible world was a kind of language and they had just learned enough of the alphabet to start making out words. And Ariston told them, when they described this, that what they were experiencing was not imagination. It was perception that had been cleaned up enough to function correctly. The world had always been structured this way. They had simply been too full of noise to notice. The oath that senior students swore upon this symbol was not a vow of loyalty to Ariston or to the school. That distinction mattered enormously to him. He was not building a following. He was not creating dependence. The oath was a commitment made by the student to themselves, witnessed by the symbol and by the community, to pursue truth at every level of their life, not just in study but in action, not just in the school but in whatever world they moved through afterward. It was a commitment to keep the channel clear, to keep asking the real questions rather than the comfortable ones, to refuse the particular kind of laziness that disguises itself as practicality, the voice that says, "This is deep enough, you understand enough, you can stop looking now." Ariston called that voice the enemy of the soul, not because it was evil, because it was convincing. And it was most convincing exactly at the moment when the next level of understanding was closest, when the discomfort of not yet knowing was at its peak, and the relief of pretending you had arrived was most tempting. The students who swore that oath changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in ways that accumulated over time into something unmistakable. They became, in the specific language Ariston used, harder to deceive. Not suspicious, not cynical, just less available for the particular kind of self-deception that most people use to get through the day. And that quality, that specific clarity, was the thing that people outside the school began to notice, and to find, depending on who they were, either deeply attractive or deeply threatening. The night the school burned, no warning came. That was the part that stayed with the survivors longest, not the fire itself but the silence that preceded it, a silence so complete that several students later said they had mistaken it for the particular quality of quiet that the school had taught them to cultivate. The streets outside had gone unusually still in the hour before. No merchants calling out, no carts on the stone road, no dogs. Just a dense, flat absence of sound that in retrospect felt nothing like peace and everything like held breath. The first sign was the smell. Burning oil, sharp and thick, spreading faster than fire from a dropped lamp or a fallen torch. This was not an accident. The students who were awake, a small group who had been in the study hall finishing a late session of geometric work, felt the smell reach them before they heard anything, and the smell alone was enough. Evander, who had been with Ariston longer than almost anyone, was on his feet before the first sound of movement outside. He crossed to the inner corridor and found Ariston already standing there in the darkness, fully alert, completely calm, as if he had been waiting for this specific moment for years. Perhaps he had. He said to Evander, without raising his voice, "Make sure everyone leaves through the north passage." Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction, back toward the inner hall. What followed happened fast enough that the survivors could only reconstruct it in fragments afterward, each person holding a different piece. The north passage emptied into a narrow lane that led away from the main streets toward the lower edge of the city. Students moved through it quickly, without sound, the discipline of years of silence training making them capable of coordinated movement in darkness without a word spoken. Some carried nothing. Some carried the small geometric tablets that had been their personal study tools. One young student, barely past his first year of training, carried the clay impression of the door symbol, the triangle of dots, which he had made weeks earlier as a study exercise, and had happened to have in his hands when the smell of burning oil reached the study hall. Ariston was not in the North Passage. Several students tried to go back. Evander stopped them. He said, in a voice that carried the full weight of everything the school had taught him about when to act and when to hold, "He knows what he is doing. Your work now is to get out and stay alive. Because what he gave you does not exist in that building. It exists in you. And if you go back and it takes you too, then nothing survives." The students who heard this understood it. The students who almost did not were held back by the ones who did, and they moved. Through the lane, through the dark, away from the orange light that was now beginning to color the sky above the rooftops of Vilia. What was lost that night was significant. The physical records, the carved tablets that mapped the proportional studies accumulated over years of collective research, the specific sequence of sound practices that Ariston had refined through careful experimentation and had not yet transmitted in full to any single student. The space itself, that courtyard, that olive tree, that particular quality of accumulated silence that had taken years to establish in the stones and the air of the place. All of it gone by morning. And Ariston himself emerged from the city before dawn, having moved through it by routes no one else knew, carrying nothing visible. He found the students gathered in a grove outside the city walls, sitting in the pre-dawn dark, and he sat down among them without ceremony, and for a long time no one spoke. Not from discipline. From the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of them equally, the way a sudden cold front presses down on a valley, total and encompassing, and impossible to argue with. When Ariston finally spoke, he did not address the attack. He did not name who was responsible or speculate about what came next. He looked at the group of people sitting in that grove, most of them still faintly illuminated by the glow still visible on the horizon behind them, and he said something that none of them forgot for the rest of their lives. He said, "They burned the container. They have no idea that they left the water." The people who destroyed the school in Vilia made one catastrophic miscalculation. They thought that what Ariston had built lived in the building. They were wrong in a way that history would spend centuries quietly proving. Because within a generation of that fire, the ideas that had been transmitted inside those stone walls began surfacing in places that had never heard of Vilia, in proportions carved into the facades of temples in cities Ariston had never visited, in the tuning systems of instrument makers who could not have explained where their methods came from, in the spatial reasoning of architects who designed buildings that produced inexplicable qualities of stillness and focus in the people who entered them. The knowledge had not been destroyed. It had been scattered. And scattered seeds, given enough time and enough suitable ground, tend to produce more than a single cultivated garden ever could. Evander spent the years after the fire traveling, not running. Traveling with purpose, the way a person moves when they have something specific to carry and a responsibility to deliver it intact. He carried no written records because there were none. He carried what Ariston had given him in the only form that truly survives the destruction of physical things, inside himself, in the quality of his attention, in the precision of his perception, in his ability to look at a proportion and feel whether it was right or fractionally off, in the way a musician feels a note that is almost in tune but not quite. He taught what he could to the people he encountered who were ready to receive it, and he did not try to recreate the school. He understood that the school had been a container appropriate to a specific moment. The moment had passed. What was needed now was not another container, but a different method of transmission. Smaller, more dispersed, harder to target. He would spend time in a city, find the people who were asking the right questions, spend weeks or months working with them directly, and then move on. He left behind him a trail of individuals who had been quietly and permanently altered by the encounter, people who began to see proportion everywhere, who began to hear the difference between a space that was built correctly and one that merely looked impressive, who began to feel in their own bodies the difference between a day lived in alignment with the deeper structure of things and a day lived in the static of accumulated distraction. These people did not form schools. They did not gather publicly. They worked in their trades and their crafts and their civic roles, and they carried what they had been given the way you carry something valuable in an inside pocket, close to the body, invisible to anyone who did not already know it was there. And the proportions kept appearing. In the spacing of columns in buildings whose architects had trained under people who had briefly encountered Evander or one of the other scattered students. In the tuning of instruments built by craftsmen who had absorbed something from a teacher who had absorbed something from someone closer to the source. In the layout of gardens and public spaces designed by people who could not have told you why they made the choices they made, except that the result felt correct in a way they could not fully articulate. The knowledge traveled in the only form that cannot be burned, embedded in the hands and eyes and interior sense of people who had been trained to carry it. This was what Ariston had understood from the beginning, though perhaps not consciously until the fire made it undeniable. The most durable form of knowledge is not the kind that is written down or built in stone. It is the kind that changes the perceiver, because a changed perceiver carries the knowledge into every act they perform, every choice they make, every space they inhabit or create. The knowledge does not live in the record. It lives in the transformation. And transformation, once it has genuinely occurred, is not reversible. You cannot unhear the signal beneath the static once you have learned to hear it. You cannot unfeel the pulse beneath the world once it has moved through you in a chamber underground and left its mark. The fire in Velia destroyed a school. It could not destroy what the school had already done to the people who passed through it. The geometry survived. The proportions survived. The understanding of vibration and harmony and the deep structure of number survived. Not intact, not complete, not in the organized and transmissible form that Ariston had spent his life assembling, but alive, distributed across minds and hands and eyes that kept finding the same patterns because the patterns were real, and reality does not stop being structured simply because the people who understood the structure are no longer gathered in one place. The last time Evander saw Ariston was in a small coastal settlement, several days' travel from Velia, less than a year after the fire. Ariston was living quietly, teaching no one formally, observing everything with the same quality of attention he had always brought to the world. He looked, Evander said later, like a man who had set down a very heavy thing and was now moving differently for the absence of its weight. Not relieved exactly, lighter. The way a river moves differently once it has passed through a narrow gorge and reached open ground. Evander asked him if he regretted building the school, given how it had ended. Ariston thought about this for a long time. Then he said that the school had done what it was supposed to do, that the ending was part of the design, even if he had not planned it. That sometimes the most important thing a container can do is break at the right moment so that what it was holding can reach further than the container ever could. That answer stayed with Evander for the rest of his life. He repeated it to the people he taught. They repeated it to the people they taught. And somewhere in that chain of transmission, across the years and the generations, and the long, slow movement of ideas through time, it reached you. Right now, in this moment. Which means the chain is still intact. Which means the water Ariston said they had failed to burn is still moving. Here is what this entire story points toward, beneath all the detail and the drama and the history. Knowledge that changes nothing in you is not knowledge. It is entertainment. The only knowledge that matters is the kind that alters the quality of your perception permanently, the kind that makes you see differently, hear differently, move through the world differently. Ariston did not build a school to create scholars. He built it to create people who had been cleaned up enough on the inside to function at the level they were actually capable of. And the obstacle to that, then as now, was never lack of information. It was noise. Accumulated, habitual, self-generated noise that fills every available space and prevents the deeper signal from being heard. The work he described, the silence, the discipline, the honest confrontation with your own patterns, was not the path to some exotic spiritual destination. It was the basic maintenance required to live as the full version of yourself, rather than the diminished version that noise produces. Now here is the question that Ariston used to ask every candidate who stood at the entrance to his school. And I want you to sit with it honestly before you answer. Not the comfortable version of the answer, the real one. If you stripped away everything you do out of habit, everything you think because you were taught to think it, Everything you want because the people around you want it too. What would actually remain? What is the signal underneath all of your static? Because most people spend their entire lives without ever finding out. And the ones who do find out, whether through a school, through a crisis, through a single moment of genuine stillness, tend to say the same thing afterward, that they cannot believe how long they waited, and that the distance between who they were before and who they became was not a long journey. It was a single step. The step of finally deciding to be quiet enough to hear what was already there. Write your answer in the comments, because that question deserves more than a passing thought. And if this story moved something in you, if it landed somewhere real, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It takes you 2 seconds, and it helps this kind of content reach the people who need it most.